bought this book at Five Below, along with two other books for $5 a piece. Elite Forces, The World's Most Skilled Fighting Units by Stephen Bull. Read this. Arcturus. So, Dr. Stephen Bull worked at the BBC and the National Army Museum in London before moving to Landshire Museums, where he was curator of military history and archaeology. He has also worked for Oxford University on projects for Europeana, the EU Digital Library. He has appeared in or presented television documentaries on related subjects. The author of many military history titles, Stephen is a member of the Chartered Institute of Archaeologists and holds an MBA. Now, this book was published in 2026. Arcturus Publishing Limited. All right, so the contents. We've got the introduction, Chapter 1, the idea of elite forces. Chapter 2, British elite forces. Chapter 3, U.S. elite forces. Chapter 4, Russian elite forces. Got a bibliography, endnotes, index, and image credits. Introduction. Many forces, both past and present, have claimed to be elite. But what does the term really mean? The fact is, defining an elite force is extremely difficult and depends on a number of factors. Some of these are based on self-perceptions either within the unit or in the war ministry of the nation concerned. Other claims to eliteness arise from performance or effectiveness in battle, currently or historically, or usefulness in specific types of situations. Some are elite simply because a monarch or emperor declares them to be such. What is certain is that elite forces and special forces are two different concepts, though they may overlap and are sometimes applied to the same entity. Elite has been defined as a select group that is superior in terms of ability or qualities to the rest of a group of society, while special forces can be defined as the units of a country's armed forces that undertake covert, counter-terrorist, and other specialized operations. In the chapters which follow, we commence with a broad survey of different types of elite forces over the sweep of history. These diverse examples are chosen as much for their variety and fame as much as any other reason. They provide illustration of how the elite idea has permeated armies and military history over millennia. While each of them is very different, some common themes can be identified across centuries of war. Thereafter, we look at three nations in greater detail. The British are examined due to their early and sometimes desperate innovations which would significantly influence other nations. The Americans also have a long history of elite forces which, in the shape of the Rangers and Marines, go back as far as 1775 and so are older than the United States itself. The very large-scale elite and special forces of the USA have also shaped a number of her allies, particularly in Southeast Asia. The Russians, who developed guards formations early in the era of the Kaiser, and later learned from the use of partisan groups, now deploy their Spetsnaz troops as a key part of virtually every campaign. Moreover, these troops, which show characteristics of light infantry and cavalry, are closely linked to Russian military intelligence, the former KGB and FSB. Readers will notice Ukrainian Special Forces SS, SBU, and SFO are only mentioned very briefly. The reason for this is that their most significant actions have happened after the main text of this volume was written. In any further work, the Spiderweb mission of 1 June 2025 is likely to take up significant space. After lengthy planning and preparations, about 100 Wasp quadcopter drones were smuggled into Russia by truck and launched to attack 5 major air bases. The total destruction or crippling of about 40 bombers was both a hefty blow to enemy aviation and a huge media victory. Chapter 1. The idea of elite forces. A few examples may help to demonstrate how big an umbrella term the concept of the elite force is. The Janissary Corps. In the Ottoman Empire, 1280 through 1923, the elite status of the Janissary came about, at least in part, because these soldiers formed the Sultan's household troops. Under the Devshirme system, promising children were forcibly recruited from among the empire's Balkan Christian subjects and raised in the Islamic faith. This probably began around 1400, though the precise date of inception is unclear. As well as an effective soldiery, the system also produced grand viziers, high-ranking advisors, and administrators who were easier to control than Turkish appointees, since they, like the military janissaries, owed their positions and importance solely to the Sultan himself. Recruitment into the Janissary Corps came as young as 7 or as old as 20 years, at which time male children were taken from their families and after 1453 relocated to Constantinople. Most were circumcised, but some were castrated to make them acceptable for service in the harem, the part of the house set apart for women. In any event, they were brought up in the Islamic faith and after thorough training pronounced suitable for either the Janissary Infantry Corps or palace duties. Janissary training naturally included physical training for war, but also what we might now regard as desk-based learning involving administration and science. Former slave children could achieve high positions in both the Sultan's forces and the imperial bureaucracy. Their rise, at least in theory, was by merit, and the Galana, the most talented, were earmarked for the highest positions. The system was met with different responses. Christian parents sometimes resorted to bribery or subterfuge to send their sons away from home and out of the hands of recruiters, while some Muslim parents did the opposite in an attempt to get their offspring included in the Devshirme in order to improve their life chances. In conflict, Ottoman forces occasionally offered an exemption from the Devshirme as an incentive to their opponents to surrender. The Praetorian Guard. Ancient Rome also boasted elite forces in the form of the Praetorian Guard and others. Under the Roman Republic, and Praetorians were initially created as bodyguard formations for senators and procurators, as well as senior generals, which the first mention of the existence of Praetorians coming about 275 BC. Praetorians were formed in cohorts of up to about 500 men, and so were more than adequate for personal protection duties, though much smaller than the legions. With the end of the Republic and the inception of the Empire, the Emperor Augustus claimed the Praetorians for himself as his escort unit in around 27 BC. The motivation for this may well have been to surround himself with the very best troops. Under Drusius, 2 Praetorian cohorts, supported by the Praetorian cavalry and a German auxiliary unit, succeeded in putting down a major mutiny in the Rhine area, following which the Praetorians saw repeated actions in war from the 1st to 3rd century AD. However, the Praetorians also proved themselves to be I want to say intriguers. Intriguers? Intriguers? Intrigers? I don't know. Capable of overthrowing one emperor and replacing him with another. As a result, Constantine the Great finally disbanded the cohorts Praetoria in 312 AD, even going so far as demolishing their barracks. The surviving personnel were not executed, however, but scattered to various parts of the empire. Orders of precedence. Defining what constituted an elite force would remain stubbornly elusive over the centuries. One early yardstick of worth or value was the idea of seniority, which older or lower numbered units being assumed to stand above the higher numbered ones or more recently formed bodies. Oddly to modern ways of thinking, when firearms were introduced to military service in the high medieval period, it was generally assumed that pikemen had greater honor than musketeers because the pike was an older weapon than the musket. Thus, in many armies, there exists an idea of precedence in which antiquity and history create a pecking order or scale of honors based on performance over time. At least some of these ideas continue into the modern world. Ranking system in the British Army. In the British Army, the regiments of horse guards and foot guards created under the Stuart monarchy of 1603 through 1714 were given precedence over those created after the English Civil Wars from 1642 through 1651. The Grenadier Guards, whose colonel-in-chief was traditionally the monarch of the day, was thus also the first foot guards and traced its lineage back to the units raised for the protection of Stuart kings. It counts the start of the current unit as 1656, when it was formed at Bruges, when Charles II, the king in waiting, was in exile during the interregnum. This unit only became the Grenadier Guards after they bested the French Imperial Guard at Waterloo in 1815. The Coldstream Guards, initially formed under General George Monck in 1650, are claimed to be the longest continually serving unit, but given that Monck, 1608 through 1670, had been a parliamentarian and a prominent figure in the Commonwealth, the cold steamers are listed second to the grenadiers. The Scots Guards lineage also goes back as far as the Civil Wars, and the Marquess of Argyll's Royal Regiment, the 3rd Regiment of Foot Guards, was not known as such until about 1700. Though the title Scottish Regiment of Foot Guards was reportedly mentioned in 1680, the Irish Guards, not formed until 1900 under Queen Victoria, was naturally the 4th in precedence, and the Welsh Guards, relative newcomers, was created in February 1915 during World War I, becoming the 5th Foot Guard unit in the official Army list. Similar considerations were applied to the Horse Guards, so 1st and 2nd Life Guards were put before the Royal Horse Guards, followed by the 7 regiments of Dragoon Guards. You keeping up with me? Because I'm over here just reading like, huh? There's a lot of shit. All right. Given the lack of a standing army prior to 1640, the Royal Guards in general had precedence over the rest of the army, which was raised as and, when needed, often on a local and temporary basis, initially using the old medieval militia system. It would make sense that the Royal Guard would be the one, after all was said and done, would have precedence over every other thing. Because who's going to be around first, right? I mean, the Royal Guard would be the first one ever, right? That makes sense. All right. The infantry of the line was also listed in order of seniority, but whether the 4th of Foot, King's Own Royal Regiment Lancaster, which was raised in 1680 and fought as Barrel's Regiment at Culloden, 1746, was objectively better or even significantly different to the 47th Lancashire Regiment of Foot, raised by Colonel Sir John Mordaunt in 1741, is questionable. Likewise, we can wonder how really different the 5th Regiment of Foot, later Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, which was raised as early as 1674, were the Royal Munster Fusiliers, motherfuckers, the Royal motherfuckers, the Royal Munster Fusiliers, okay, that's how they pronounced it back then, I guess, right? Which did not exist until an amalgamation of the 101st and 104th Regiments of Foot in 1881. For about 2 centuries, the British Line infantry regiments fought in the same way as each other, using much of the same weapons, wearing much the same uniform. Distinctions were drawn more by recruiting areas and the battle honors carried on their colors than by any speciality. Other ranks were drawn from the working classes, while officers were middle and upper class men. Precedence systems in France. Similar systems existed in many other countries, with separate guard, line infantry, and cavalry formations. Under the Ancien regime of France, prior to the Revolution, the infantry was organized on a regional basis, with or without a royal title, and majority wore white uniforms. With the coming of the Empire of Napoleon I, 1769 through 1821, the French army ceased to draw its legitimacy or claims to elite status from a monarch. Instead, it was based on the decree of the emperor and exploits of his campaigns. The infantry now wore blue, and regimental flags were based on the revolutionary tricolor. Just 3 days after his coronation in 1804, Napoleon distributed aigles based on the eagle standards of the Roman legions. These standards represented the regiments raised by the various departments of France and were intended to institute feelings of pride and loyalty among the troops who would be the backbone of Napoleon's new imperial regime. Under the eagle figure was the regimental number and words Garde Imperio. These were regarded as sacred symbols and were to be defended to the death, so the loss of an eagle was accounted a disgrace. Nevertheless, the first eagle was captured by Russian cavalry at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. 3 were taken in a day when an entire French corps led by General Perry Dupont surrendered at Balen in 1808. Several fell into British hands in the Peninsula War of 1808 through 1814, and 2 more at Waterloo, one being taken by the British Royal Scots Greys. As a result, the Scots Greys adopted an eagle cap badge over the word Waterloo. Already Scotland's senior regiment, formed in 1681, the Greys, now took an element of their tradition and elite status from their performance in battle and enemy symbolism. Riflemen and grenadiers. Whether troops could be considered as either elite or special due to using a new or unusual weapon remains an open question. Grenades, which existed as early as the beginning of the 16th century, were soon in use as a siege or storming weapon and were carried mainly by engineers or grenadiers. By the later 17th century, grenadiers were often attached to the infantry and commonly wore distinctive uniforms with grenadier headgear taking the form of a tall mitre cap similar to shape to a bishop's mitre or a fur-covered grenadier cap. These are said to have been introduced so that an overarm throw of a grenade would not be impeded, in the way that it might be the traditional broad-brimmed headgear of a musketeer. Grenadiers existed as both complete regiments or battalions, or as a company of an infantry battalion in many armies. Grenadier was also used as a general term for German infantry soldier from late 1944 to the end of World War II, when Volksgrenadier, People's Grenadier divisions were formed. Rifles were already in use at a surprisingly early date, and various rifle units have been described as elite. Rifled guns were devised about 1500, but would remain uncommon for another century. Their advantage was that spiral grooving inside the barrel of a piece introduced a spin on the projectile as it left the barrel. This spin stabilized the shot in much the same way as a gyroscope. Though probably first designed for hunting, rifles were also useful in war, being more accurate, often over greater distances, than smoothbore muskets. One of the earliest known military rifle units was the Guard of Christian IV of Denmark, 1620. Screwed rifled pieces were also used in the 30 Years' War from 1618 until 1648 and English Civil Wars 1642 through 51, where they were exceptionally useful for fighting from fortifications or other cover. Using a rifle in this manner overcame one of its key disadvantages, which was its relative slowness to load. While many riflemen were hunters or farmers in their civilian existence, as would also be the case in North America in the 1700s and in Central Europe, military rifle units were also created by the wealthy and the royal, often the only people who could afford the to equip a body of men with one of the most expensive weapons of the day. Major Patrick Ferguson, 1744 through 80, was unusual in that he both designed a military rifle and led it in battle, the British Army unit that carried it. While its caliber was the same as ordinary British military carbines, it was one of the first breech-loading military long arms. The breech of Ferguson's ordnance rifle was opened by using the trigger guard as a crank to rotate the breech plug, dropping it so as to admit a ball and powder. Its rate of fire was excellent when compared to either muskets or other rifles of the era. It has been claimed the Ferguson could manage 6 shots a minute at a target 183 meters, 200 yards away, a performance roughly double that of the ordinary musket in both swiftness and distance. Another advantage was that with the breech screwed shut, the powder charge was relatively secure from wind and rain, which often rendered other firearms inoperative. Ferguson's men of his experimental rifle corps were mainly trained light infantry men from General Howie's army, and they fought at the Battle of Brandywine in September 1777 and possibly elsewhere. While it seems reasonable to claim Ferguson's experimental rifle corps as either an elite or special unit, its impact was limited for a number of reasons. The first of these was that the ordnance rifle was difficult and expensive to produce. A second was that its stock was weak, since the mechanism was large in relation to the woodwork. It was also true that only about 200 ordnance rifles were made, and such a small corps could not therefore have a decisive impact on a major battle. Major Ferguson was himself badly wounded in Brandywine and was killed at the Battle of King's Mountain, leading a force of loyalists in 1780, age 36. Another British rifle unit that could lay claims to being elite also began as an experimental corps of riflemen in 1800, but within 3 years of its foundation was transformed into a regular unit, albeit with a remarkable weapon under the title 95th Regiment of Foot Rifles. The piece they carried was the flintlock rifle designed by English gunsmith Ezekiel Baker, 1758 through 1836. While the Baker was muzzle-loaded and therefore not particularly swift to load, it was accurate against individuals up to about 183 meters to 200 yards and could hit formed bodies of men at 274 meters, about 300 yards or more. Its inspiration was the German Jaeger rifle, firing a .625 caliber lead ball from a 76 centimeter barrel, and greased patches helped ensure a good tight fit for the ball. The Baker would later be copied for other units, including the Duke of Cumberland's Corps of Sharpshooters, parts of the King's German Legion, and the light companies of some line infantry regiments, such as the 23rd Regiment of Foot, Royal Welsh Fusiliers. So it is that while Baker is recorded to have produced fewer than 1,000 examples of his rifle, additional pieces were also made by other contractors. The Baker was used to significant effect throughout the Napoleonic Wars, notably in the Peninsular and Waterloo campaigns. Baker rifles also saw use in North America in the New Orleans campaign, 1814 and 1815, in Canada during the War of 1812, as well as in Mexico. The Swiss Guard. A very old force generally construed as elite, and that still exists but is otherwise very difficult to define, is the Pontifical Swiss Guard, first established in 1506 by Pope Julius II, the Guard still wears a gaudy 16th century style stripped costume from ceremonial duties. A less exotic uniform, though still of antiquated appearance, it is used for night duty and exercises. Often described simply as the Swiss Guard, members of the Papal Force are literally Swiss, being Catholic citizens of Switzerland, recruited between the ages of 19 and 30 with a minimum height requirement of at least 174 centimeters, which is 5'9", signing on for a minimum of 2 years, guards receiving a tax-free, if modest, salary and accommodation, and are permitted to marry after 5 years. Successful applicants to the Guard are sworn in every year on 6 May. The oath made in one of the Swiss languages is sworn on the Guard banner and commits them to serve and protect the Pope up to and including death. While the Guard has a very long history, this has not been entirely uninterrupted, having a several short disbandments and one long, if partial, interruption between 1548 and 1798, when the Guard was reduced to a much smaller cadre. The first Swiss Guard came into existence due to an alliance between Pope Sixtus IV and the Swiss Confederacy, when the pontiff and his successors began hiring Swiss troops. The arrangement was made more permanent during the time of Pope Julius II and former Bishop of Lausana, who asked the Swiss Diet to provide a constant force of 200 men. Diet, probably. This was financed by the German Fugger family of bankers and merchants. The Swiss marched to Rome over the winter of 1505, arriving on 22 January 1506, this date becoming recognized as the official foundation date of the Guard. Julius II would later describe his faithful Swiss as the defenders of the Church's freedom. Their usefulness would be heroically demonstrated in May 1527, when the 189-strong Guard fought to the death during the sack of Rome by the Holy Roman Empire. A majority, including their commander Caspar Rost, were killed, and just 42 survived to escort Pope Clement VII to safety, though he would later surrender himself. Following this disastrous episode, the Guard had to be topped up with German mercenaries until 1548, when the Swiss Guard became Swiss again. After the end of the Italian Wars in 1559, the Guard came to be regarded as honorary and ceased to be a combat force. By the mid-19th century, the Guard had reached a low ebb, recruiting men who were Swiss only by descent rather than birth, and being trained only in parade ground drill rather than fighting skills. Their strength was now barely 100. Between 1910 and 1921, under their commander Julius Rapound, the Guard was reformed with active recruitment of native Swiss men and improved exercises. The Vatican City became a sovereign state in 1929, and thereafter a Papal Grenadier Corps was formed, becoming responsible for security and public order. This was only changed significantly from the late 1970s, when responsibility shifted again and the Guard establishment was fixed at 90. There were further increases in strength in succeeding decades, with the establishment fixed at 107 halberdiers in 2010. By 2024, the Guard numbered 135, including a generous allocation of 9 officers. The commander now ranked as colonel, with a lieutenant colonel as his deputy. There were now 85 halberdiers, the equivalent of private in many armies, and 41 non-commissioned officers. The rank of a guard is usually expressed in German, and his rank insignia are German in style, with officers having stars on their shoulder boards. The most dramatic changes were instituted after May 1981 following an assassination attempt on John Paul II. The Swiss Guard was then transformed into a modern protection corps with small arms, a plain-clothes team becoming responsible for the personal safety of the Pope, his staff, and guests. Recently, an additional combat-type uniform has been introduced in addition to the traditional uniforms, and for special duties, up-to-date weaponry is available. While the Swiss Guard is tiny in the modern context, it appears both efficient and a commensurate response to the issues it is likely to face. Threats to the pontiff and terrorism are probable, if rare, eventualities, but in contrast to the past, much more likely than the appearance of a hostile external military, since Italy surrounded the Vatican City and is both an EU and NATO member. Moreover, more than 3/4 of Italians identify as Catholics. Napoleon's elite forces. Perhaps the best-known historical French elite force was the Imperial Guard of Napoleon I, 1769 to 1821. Often directly commanded by the Emperor himself, the Imperial Guard was a veritable army within the French army, comprising cavalry, infantry, artillery, and engineer units. The direct predecessor of the Imperial Guard was the Garde des Consuls, or Consular Guard, formed in 1799 by uniting the Guard of the Directory and the Grenadiers of the Legislature, which together had totaled barely 1,000 men. The new title, Imperial Guard, was granted in May 1804 when Napoleon had himself and his wife Josephine crowned as Emperor and Empress at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Napoleon was accompanied to the cathedral by mounted grenadiers of the Guard and gendarmes of the Guard. And while it maintained a unique status, the Guard grew swiftly under Napoleon's reign, being about 8,000 men in 1804, but ballooning to nearly 100,000 at the time of the invasion of Russia in 1812. At the same time, the Guard had become a corps in its own right and was organized into divisions, each having a colonial general who was simultaneously a marshal of France. The Imperial Guard cavalry alone comprised of cavalry corps, including such illustrious regiments as the Horse Grenadiers, Empress Dragoons, Polish, Dutch, and Lithuanian Lancers, the Grenadiers d'Élite de la Garde Impériale, and the Mamelukes, which initially fought in North Africa, but were not of full regimental strength. Another oddity of the mounted Imperial Guard was the sailors of the Imperial Guard, recruited from the Navy, but wearing hussar-style uniforms, while its officers used naval-style ranks. The duties of the sailors of the Imperial Guard introduced crewing boats used by the Emperor. The elite of the elite infantry were the Old Guard, of which there were 4 regiments, both grenadiers and chasseurs. While its stringent requirements were not universally met in practice, men on the Old Guard were supposed to be veterans of a minimum of 3 campaigns and 10 years service, with other units having faced enemy fire at the front and being aged under 35 on entry. Height requirement was a minimum of 173 meters, 5 foot 8 inches. Interestingly, this was waived if a man had been awarded the Legion of Honor, France's highest order of merit, an award instituted by Napoleon himself in 1802. The elite status of the Guard thus depended on long service experience, bravery, and loyalty. It had little or nothing to do with novel tasks of weaponry, and its training was essentially similar to other parts of the French army. Old Guard troops were regarded as especially honorable and granted various privileges, including higher pay. The Imperial Guard was disbanded after the fall of the Emperor in 1815 and the return of King Louis the 18th. Prussia, guards and statesmen. Another early modern nation of fearsome military reputation was Persia. This state had been founded under the Teutonic Knights of the Middle Ages, whose conquest of the area had all but extinguished the local pagan tribal societies and the culture of the original Persians. These peoples had spoken their own languages akin to those of others in the eastern Baltic coastal area, but by the 15th century, the Baltic Crusaders had not only brought militant Christianity to the Persians, but also the German language and new styles of military organization and fortification. Originally looking to the Catholic Church and Roman Pope for guidance, the duchy became a Protestant state when Albert, Duke of Persia, formally adopted Lutheranism in 1525. The survival of Persia over the next 3 centuries would depend on warrior kings and a Persian army that became a pillar of society and the school of the nation. Persia would come to be compared to classical Sparta, having a harshly disciplined military and troops inured to hardship. This was perceived as entirely necessary, since it was the military that ensured both the survival of the Persian state and the dynasty of the Persian kings, the Hohenzollerns. This was no easy task, given the proximity of Russia and Poland and the growth of the vast Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, which at its height occupied not only the modern areas of Lithuania and Poland, but Belarus and most of Ukraine. Sweden, just across the Baltic, was also a threat to the Persian integrity, especially in the age of the Vasa kings in 1523 and through 1654, and in the 17th century when Sweden became involved in the 30 Years' War under Gustavus Adolphus, 1594 through 1632. During the period 1550 to 1650, there occurred what many commentators would come to call a military revolution. This revolution was not only about improved navies and artillery, but also the integration of infantry, cavalry, and artillery with their attendant logistics. Gustavus, who was elevated to become known as Gustavus the Great in 1634, not long after his death in battle at Lutzen in 1632, fighting against an imperial army, came to be regarded as a doyen of the military revolution and was revered by many subsequent generals, including both Napoleon and Persian soldier and theorist of war Karl von Clausewitz, 1780 to 1831. The Persian army reached a peak of effectiveness under King Frederick II the Great, 1712 through 1786, leading to territorial expansions, including the conquest of the Austrian province of Silesia and parts of Poland. While being a soldier monarch, Frederick was also a cultured liberalizer and reformer. His army was the fourth largest in Europe and consumed about 3/4 of the state budget, even though the population of Persia ranked only as 12th largest. According to Voltaire, 1694 through 1778, Persia was not a state in possession of an army, but an army in possession of a state. Frederick would command his army at 17 major battles as well as many minor engagements and sieges, favoring quick campaigns intended to exhaust Persians' limited resources. His command innovations laid some of the groundwork for the later German general staff. Frederick's elite troops were his grenadiers, distinguished by their grenade bags and cloth-covered grenadier caps sporting metal plates. The 1st Battalion of the King's Regiment, Regiment, were the most impressive, being recruited from the tallest men and having red uniform distinctions. While the Persian army failed against Napoleon in 1806 at Jena and Auerstedt, this would be but a temporary setback. After the debacle in Russia in 1812, in which many Persian troops were conscripted to fight alongside their former enemy, there were dramatic reforms, including the introduction of various categories of reserve, hugely expanding the size of the Persian army in war. It is interesting to observe that while Napoleon put his longest-serving troops into his imperial guard, the Persians chose to put time-expired men on the standing army into the reserve and subsequently landwehr regiments with an edict of 1813 calling up all able men between the ages of 18 and 45 not currently in regular army. Many of these troops fought in the wars of Liberation, 1813, and the Waterloo Campaign, which rid Persian lands of the French and would stir future German national settlements. During the later part of the Napoleonic period, the Persian army boasted not only a strong artillery arm and the mass reservists, but a guard of both infantry and cavalry. The guard cavalry included cuirassiers, hussars, lancers, dragoons, the infantry, the Garde zu Fube grenadiers, Jaeger and Schutzen. The Persian infantry as a whole was now well organized and trained according to modern principles patterned on the French model. While Persia would remain the most significant state in German lands for a further century, there was no German nation until Persian Chancellor Bismarck succeeded in diplomatically and militarily outmaneuvering both the Danes in 1864 and the Austrian Empire in 1866, then France in 1870. The German Empire was then proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in January 1871. At this point, the Persian king, William I, became the first emperor or Kaiser of the Second Empire, and while a number of smaller states were subsumed into the existing North German Confederation, 3 states remained kingdoms: Saxony, Bavaria, and Württemberg. All 3 kept their own armies, war ministries, and kings. But in war, it was the Kaiser who commanded all, acting through the chief of the general staff. This would have an impact on the elite forces of all, since not only the Persian Guard, but the guards of all the German states were now in the same order of battle. The Persian Guard formed 2 divisions based in Berlin and Potsdam, with Guard cavalry in 4 brigades in the small towns: the Saxon, Lieb, Grenadier and Grenadiers, Württemberg, Guard Grenadiers and Grenadiers, the Bavarian Lieb Regiment, and others were all deployed in the regionally based corps and divisions of the German army. German shock troops. A body of troops often thought of as elite or special are the German stormtroopers, or I can't pronounce it, it's in German, shock troopers of World War I. While many have dubbed them elite retrospectively, this was not the idea at the time. Rather, they were intended as an exemplar of the latest tactics to be emulated by the German armies as a whole. The problem stormtroopers were designed to resolve was the tyranny of the trench. As of late 1914, trenches had locked the Western Front solid, with the men defending them able to hold their coverage positions against greater numbers who had to cross open ground. The machine gun compounded the problem, since these automatic killing machines could put a greater number of bullets in the air than dozens of riflemen operating weapons reloaded by operating a bolt before every shot. In many actions, attackers were beaten off, or if they managed to break into a trench, might be thrown out again by local counterattacks. While there were many attempts to set armies in motion again by numbers, new weapons, sheer weight of artillery, vehicles, gas, and tunnels, the German High Command sought a tactical and infantry-centered solution. Between the end of 1914 and spring 1915, Oberst Max Baur of the General Staff, a protege of Erich Ludendorff, the first quartermaster general of the German army, brought into being 3 experimental units. The purpose of the exercise was to test different types of trench warfare weapons and, perhaps even more importantly, demonstrate ways they could be used to promote breakthroughs. The first experimental unit was commanded by Hauptmann Bernhard Redenmann. He was a manly man, that motherfucker was. Previously, fire chief of Posen in Persia. Ready man brought together a team of just 50 all ranks to create Flame Men Werfer. Abteilung Ready Man. flamethrower detachment ready man, even before 1914 was out. And by February 1915, this was practicing with Fiddler-type flamethrowers capable of projecting short-range jets of flames under pressure. The detachment could be transported in trucks and was committed to action at Malincourt near Verdun on 26 February 1915. The second experimental unit was commanded by Major Loathes. The tested trench mortars, both the Ready Man team and the Loathes team, appeared to have done useful work, and both trench mortars and flamethrowers were used increasingly frequently as the war progressed through. Loathes himself was killed at Verdun. Though Loathes was killed himself at Verdun. However, it is the third experimental unit that had the biggest impact on the development of shock and storm tactics. Led by an engineer officer, Major Calso, this was entrusted with trials of a new 37mm Grupp light cannon with 20 guns and half a battalion of men drawn primarily from ersatz or replacements troops. Calso worked out a scheme in which combat engineers pushed forward under cover of small steel shields. Having gained a little ground, the new light artillery was then pushed forward to engage enemy machine gun posts and resistance nests by direct fire. With these neutralized, the rest of the Sturmabteilung storm detachments SA could move up, fighting their way through with grenades. Calso's team was moved to the Western Front in June 1915 and met with heavy losses. Bayeux was not deterred. He replaced Calso with Hauptmann Wilhelm Rohr, a determined company commander of the Garde Schutzen Battalion, Guards Rifles Battalion, who soon modified the Calso system and wisely committed his men to battle a company at a time in concert with the infantry. Sorry about that. After a period in the Upper Alsace, Sturmabteilung Rohr, Jesus Christ, as it was now known, fought on the Schwarzmael, a hill near the Ling battlefield, in October of 1915. Here, supported by flamethrowers, Rohr's men jumped into the enemy trenches and bombed the opposition out. Before the French could organize their own counterattack, supporting infantry advanced with tools and sandbags so trench blocks could be created, consolidating the German hold on the captured trench. Rohr's unit later enlarged to become Sturm Battalion Number 5, Rohr, may have claims to be the first stormtrooper unit, but there were many others over the next couple of years. By 1916, many individual regiments were spawning storm companies, and soon each German army was creating its own Sturm Battalion. However, Bayeux was clear that stormtroopers were not to be seen as an elite, rather they were a troop, a teaching unit, or exemplar for the army as a whole. The objective was to make sure the entire German army learned the new shock methods. Some of the first to be instructed were very run-of-the-mill troops indeed. From Landwehr divisions of older men Signs of what was going on can be found in the manual Narc Amphimito Close Combat Materials, published in 1916. Among other information, this illustrated use of grenades and small group tactics in and against shell holes. Whew! Man, some of these words are fucking nuts, bro. It's like, what the fuck is that shit? NAHRKAMPFMITTEL. That's a fucking word, bro. Yeah, alright. While shock troops were used in modest numbers as early as the Battle of the Somme, July through November 1916, training the entire German army in new tactics at a time when production was insufficient for demands and recruits barely numerous enough to maintain the very long fronts proved problematic. Nevertheless, the new tactics were used at the Third Battle of Ypres, Riga, and Cambria in 1917. By this time, German infantry were no longer attacking in old-fashioned skirmish lines, but in loose, open columns of reduced company strength. Commonly, such columns were about 120 men in number and included grenade throwers and carriers, plus at least 2 light machine guns for supporting fire. The appearance of shock troops and the publicity that surrounded them in the Battle of Riga in September 1917 led commentators to make several erroneous assumptions. One of these was that the new methods were actually invented on the Eastern Front, although the General Oskar von Hutter, 1857 through 1934, victor of Riga, had invented stormtrooper tactics himself. These misleading myths would hold sway for almost a century. What is not a myth is that German methods of the latter part of the World War I had a decisive impact on both that war and most wars since. It was also true that stormtrooper tactics matured around the time of Russia's collapse in 1917, giving Germany the opportunity to transfer large numbers of men to the West. The codification of stormtrooper methods for a major offensive as set out in the manual Der Angriff im Stellungskrieg. The attack in position warfare in January 1918. Lifted shock troops out of the tactical and local and into the realm of strategy. Nevertheless, the German spring offensive of 1918 ultimately failed, at least in part because similar methods were already being developed by France, Britain, and the United States. So the caption for this picture: German shock troops pictured at Riga with grenades, gas masks, and steel helmets. Shock and storm tactics were part of a revolution in warfare that ushered in many new innovations. However, the idea that these methods were devised on the Eastern Front in 1917 is a myth. Experimentation had begun in the West at least 2 years earlier. Alright, how much more do we got in this fucking chapter? Oh man, chapter 1's kind of long, huh? I can knock that out, though. I'm going to knock out the first chapter. All right. Other European shock troops. The French had come to the conclusion that platoons with a mixture of weapons were crucial by 1916, and the British that a reliable light machine gun, such as the American-designed Lewis, was important to both infantry attack and defense as early as 1915. The U.S. War Department in Washington devoured and translated the tactical manuals of both their allies and enemies wholesale to get abreast of the latest methods in 1917 and 1918. The Italians were also early adopters of combat engineers and of shock tactics, though it does not appear the Italian arditi, daring ones, were the result of staff-level experiments. The reparti d'assalto, assault troops, were also formed by Colonel Bassi in mid-1917, and like the German shock troops, they were intended to puncture the enemy defenses with the intention of preparing the way for a German advance by the infantry. Interestingly, experimentation and improvisation had begun much earlier, as indeed had been the case with the Germans, and Italian regiments had actually begun to create their own reconnaissance patrols for probing the enemy lines before the end of 1914. These were marked out not only by their use of close-range weaponry and explosive designed to cut through enemy wire and obstacles, but as of 1916, a special insignia with the royal monogram indicating their status as Ardito. The early Campani della Morte, companies of death, as they were sometimes dubbed, were not strictly shock troops, but certainly qualified as elite combat engineers. Shit. If Italian shock troops have a father figure, a likely contender is Major General Francesco Grazioli, 1869 through 1951. Grazioli had passed through the war school at Civitavecchia before World War I, and commanded a grenadier battalion by 1910, soon participating in the Italo-Turkish War of 1911 through 1912, before further promotions to command 8th Army Corps in World War I. At the Battle of Caporetto, German and Austro-Hungarian forces advanced, but Grazioli managed his own breakthrough to Vittorio Veneto using 2 corps and the Lambro Brigade, including many Arditi. Grazioli also advised the reformation of the Italian infantry along similar lines to other modern forces with Plotoni Speciali, which is just special platoons, becoming building blocks of larger attack formations. These 36-man platoons were to be divided into 3 9-man patrols or sections with a mixture of grenades, carbines, and daggers for close attack, while the 4th section included 2 Villers Perosia machine pistols These innovations appear to have been partially implemented by late 1916, while Grazioli worked in concert with Colonel Giuseppe Bassi of the 150 Infantry Regiment, the officer who is reputed to have proposed the modification of the Villers Perosia machine guns for use as one-man trench sweepers or submachine guns. All right. The caption of that picture says, "A German soldier with the new MP-18 9mm machine pistol. The forerunner of many submachine guns, France, 1918, its pistol-sized cartridge made fire and movement practical, particularly in the confines of trenches or built-up areas." Italian Arditi wearing gas masks and French-style steel helmets during training in 1917. In the interwar period, Grazioli remained loyal to the monarchy despite his fascist leanings. Even so, his calls for the dissolution of the Italian staff were ignored, with Grazioli himself being made deputy chief of the army staff in 1925. The French Foreign Legion. Another force that arguably qualifies as elite, but again defines precise classification, is the Legion Étrangère, known to the English-speaking world as the French Foreign Legion, created under Louis Philippe, King of the French in 1773 through 1850. That's when he was alive. The French Foreign Legion was founded in 1831 to allow foreign nationals to serve France. 6 national battalions made up the early Legion, with one each for Swiss, Poles, Germans, Italians, Spaniards, and Dutch Belgians. Other nationalities could join, but went into one of these larger groupings. During the First Carlist War, 1833 through 1840, the national battalions were dissolved, and the original Legion being itself dissolved in 1838 when numbers had dipped below viability, though back in France a new Foreign Legion was soon raised. As part of the Armée d'Afrique, Army of Africa, the legionaries would be associated with France's colonial project for more than a century. Its African campaigns spanned much of the African continent, including what are now Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Madagascar, West Africa, Chad, Zaire, Central Africa, Gabon, Rwanda, Djibouti, Somalia, the Republic of the Congo, Ivory Coast, and Mali. At times, the Legion was also deployed elsewhere to the Crimea during war with Russia, to Spain and Italy, Mexico, and to the motherland during the 1870 war with Persia and later back to France, fucking, and I'm again to fight on the Western Front against the unified German army. In World War II, the Legion was active in the Norwegian campaign, North Africa, and Syria. Since 1945, the Legion Entrengia has been regarded as a go-anywhere force, seeing not only campaigning in Africa, but also Indochina, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. Okay. German elite forces in World War II. Which of the German land forces of World War II can reasonably be defined as elite is a particularly difficult question, the answer to which depends on which period of the 1939 through 45 war we take. For the period September 1939 to autumn 1941, German armies swept all before them from the Atlantic coast and the Arctic and to the gates of Leningrad and Moscow. Later on, the Germans were pushed back on all fronts and against all manner of opponents in North Africa, Russia, and France alike. American World War II battalion commander and military theorist Colonel Trevor Dupuy, 1916 to 1995, came to the simple, if not simplistic, conclusion that German units were better than their Allied equivalents by means of what he later dubbed the quantified judgment method. A sample of engagements were looked at to determine outcomes in numerical terms. The party with the most favorable source was found to be the best, and the best were the Germans, despite their comprehensive defeat in 1944 through 45. There was some merit in such studies, and applying these ideas to conflicts before they occur in real world has helped to sharpen predictions through what has since been promoted as the Tactical Numerical Deterministic Model, the TNDM. Similarly, there have been useful attempts to create a league table of effectiveness for British divisions in 1914 through 1918. These reached the surprising conclusions it mattered very little whether a division was regular, volunteer, or conscript, yet war is not a hockey league, and reducing soldiers who are people with regimental numbers to a number per se does not tell us everything particularly important. Certainly, evaluation through mathematics is not the only way to look at the question of eliteness. I was given an elite status. There's this app that I forget the name of the app, but I looked up 100-pound dumbbell bicep curls, hammer curls, 100 pounds. It said elite level. German measures of eliteness. The Nazi regime's own definition of what was or was not elite was almost diametrically opposite to the Dupuy methods, as well as distinctively different to what its enemies may have assumed. Significantly, the Nazis judged their own military forces on a couple of factors that are almost impossible to quantify. The first of these was political loyalty. Those who died, or were most obviously prepared to die, for Nazism, or the idea of Germany as fatherland, were depicted as the most elite. Add to that willpower deployed fanatically in the service of the cause, and we have a picture of what the Nazis, if not Germans in general, assumed to constitute the military elite. Belief in the central tenets of Nazism and its Weltanschauung worldview went a long way in making up for a lack of practical military experience when it came to command positions, and Hitler had a built-in suspicion of the traditional German general staff and army command even before he had subsumed them to his own control. Historic success in battle, as lauded by the British, French, and Russians, came quite a long way down the list of possible elite attributes. In some instances, German past victories were viewed as tainted, since they were achieved in the name of the monarchy. Worse still were any associations with Weimar Germany, regarded by the Nazis as corrupted and diminished by the Treaty of Versailles, and Jewish politicians. Obvious exceptions to this outlook were the victories of Frederick the Great, whom Hitler saw as a role model of virtue, determination, and military prowess. Modernity and suitable political inspiration became regarded as elite qualities in their own right. So it was that Heinrich Leopold Himmler, 1900 through 1945, faithful Heinrich, given the title of Rich Schfeuer, as early as 1929, was seen as the most loyal of the Nazi leaders until well into 1945. He was promoted repeatedly, first in the civil sphere and then in the military, where he became not only head of the Schutzstaffel SS and the military units, but also chief of the replacement or home army. All this was in spite of near total lack of military experience prior to 1939. Moreover, the SS was always political because it was part of the party, not an historic element of Heer German army. Its roots were in both the SA, which had acted as bouncers and street fighters for the party and party meetings, and the Schutzstaffel of protection squadron that had served as bodyguards to Hitler and his cronies since the earliest days of the movement. A unit named Sturmtrupp Adolf Hitler was formed as early as 1923, starting with fewer than a dozen men. Almost inexplicably, the party was even given control of the Volkssturm, the Levy and Massey national militia, brought into being in October 1944. Remarkably, it was not a party official who had proposed this belated reinforcement to dwindling German military strength, but General Heinz Guderian, 1888 through 1954, then chief of the German General Staff. Himmler's personal empire gave him not only huge influence and a position from which to keep himself in the eye of Hitler, but control of concentration camps and prisoners, which could be turned into production facilities for various military supplies, including uniforms and footwear, as well as weapons. This gave him a head start on the levers of state against potential rivals such as Albert Speer, the armaments minister from 1942. Almost done with the first chapter. The Lebendartstes SS Adolf Hitler. Taking all this into account, a good case can be made that Nazi Germany's premier elite unit was the Lebendarts SS Adolf Hitler, the LSSAH, a title confirmed by Himmler in 1934. Initially, many of its tasks were ceremonial, as for example, in forming honors guards at the Nuremberg Party rallies. Yet its first significant action was the political murder of suspect SA officers and other potential traitors. As of 1935, the previous black uniformed Lebastandret adopted a gray combat uniform, similar, though not identical, to that of the Heer. All these fucking stupid-ass fucking words. Fucking can't pronounce none of this fucking shit. Fucking sound retarded. Every 5 seconds, some retarded-ass insanity shit. It's like 900 goddamn letters long. And then it means something that's like one fucking word. One little tiny, like, 3-letter word. It's like, why couldn't you just say that? Why do you have to go fucking like, blab for like an hour and a half in some language, and then in our language it's like, word. It's like, what the fuck, man? What the fuck? Like, fucking morons, man. Some language you take 100,000 years to speak what we speak in 5 minutes, right? What the fuck, man? So fucking goddamn annoying. Alright. The uniforms of the SS were not merely intended to be elegant, dramatic, or intimidating, but consciously drew inspiration from German elite units of the past. Black echoed the attire of the Brunswick army that had fought Napoleon and the Persian Guard Hussars. Black was also adopted by several countries as a tank crew uniform, as much for practicality as anything, since troops operating armor in the 1930s and 1940s were almost universally subject to oil leaks and stains. During the later 1930s, the Lebensstandart took part in the occupations of Austria, the Sudetenland, Bohemia, and Moravia, expanded to a modernized infantry regiment of 3 battalions with its own artillery, anti-tank, reconnaissance, and engineers subunits. It fought in Poland, where it quickly became associated with atrocities, and its performance on the battlefield was questioned on grounds of profligacy, with the lives of its own men. Despite this, the Lebensstandart was further expanded, gaining its own tracked assault gun battery for the French and Low Countries campaigns in 1940, when Wehrmacht High Command OKW ordered a halt outside the Dunkirk perimeter. Sepp Dietrich, 1892 to 1966, the LSSAH commander, continued to attack with one of his battalions, winning the Knight's Cross rather than a reprimand. The Wormhaunt massacre of British and French prisoners then followed on 28 May 1940. That the Nazi regime valued hardness and ruthlessness over adherence to the laws of war can be deduced from the fact that having awaited the abortive Operation Cillian on the Channel coast of Libstendart, was then brought up to the full brigade size and participated in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941. During these operations, SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, leading the reconnaissance battalion, cleared the Klesoria Pass, and then the LSSAH inflicted serious damage on British, Greek, and Anzac forces. In the victory parade through Athens, the LSSAH was given prominence due to its performance. Expanded yet again to a division, the LSSAH was attacked to 14 Panzer Corps for the invasion of the Soviet Union in June. Having fought its way into Ukraine, it was implicated in the massacre of about 4,000 Soviet prisoners near Kherson. In repeated and heavy fighting, including the capture of Mariupol, the LSSAH eventually advanced as far as Rostov before retreating to defensive positions, then being overdrawn to France for refitting as a Panzer Grenadier Division back in the Kharkiv region. By early 1943, the LSSAH was instrumental in the retaking of that city, and especially Dzerzhinsky Square, which was prominently renamed Platz der Lebensstarty. A string of new atrocities marked the progress of the division. While Dietrich was promoted to lead the new 1st SS Panzer Corps Leibstandarte, a new 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend was also created using now seasoned LSSAH officers in senior positions. The LSSAH remained on high Russian front until July 1943, fighting at the massive tank battle of Kursk, engaging with the Russian 5th Guards tank army near Prokhorovka, but was finally drawn when Operation Citadel ended and the Western Allies attacked Sicily. Kursk alone cost the LSSAH the better part of 3,000 men dead, wounded, or missing, and having left much of its heavy equipment in the east for use by other SS formations. It again required re-equipping. In Italy, the formation was engaged in anti-partisan operations and almost inevitably became implicated in further war crimes. Yet the Eastern Front remained the most critical theater, and it was there the LSSAH was deployed again as a Panzer Division in November 1943, fighting in various sectors, including Zhytomyr and Chersk-Asi. A division performed firefighting missions to secure one sector after another and made relief attempts to rescue other divisions. Eventually, the LSSAH was withdrawn again, this time to join 1 SS Panzer Corps in Belgium. During the Normandy campaign, the LSSAH was initially positioned to cover the Pas de Calais and arrived in the battle zone piecemeal in late June 1944. It then defended against the British and Canadians south of Caen until relieved, making counterattacks against Operation Goodwood in mid-July. While this was partially successful, a succession of British and Canadian operations unhinged the front, and U.S. armor, now making good progress as a result of Operation Cobra, threatened the German flanks and rear. The LSSAH was then teamed with SS divisions Das Reich and other formations for a strike towards Mortain, with bad weather initially hampering Allied air operations. Das Reich recaptured Mortain, but not long afterwards, the LSSAH became encircled in the Falaise pocket along with many other units. While some elements of the LSSAH succeeded in breaking out, much equipment was then left behind, and by the time the remaining troops had left France, the Lebensstadt had suffered a further 5,000 casualties. With SS Standenführer William Morency, 1911 through 2001, now in command, the LSSAH was prepared for action yet again, being committed to the Ardennes offensive at the spearhead of the operation of 16 December 1944. Plagued by fuel shortages and U.S. resistance on the Elsenborn Ridge, progress was slow. The frustrated SS men took their vengeance on prisoners at Malmedy before finally reaching Stavelot on 18 December. SS Panzer Army with most of the LSSAH ended their war in the east, though Moenke and part of the Lebensstadt were in Berlin. While Sepp Dietrich was sentenced to death in absentia for issuing illegal orders and staging executions, he avoided the hangman in 1945 and served just 10 years in prison. Later, Dietrich was detained again and served a further 18 months for the 1934 SA murders. However, his attempts to rehabilitate both his own men and armed SS formations in general were less than successful. Even so, today it is sometimes argued that Waffen-SS and the rest of the SS were completely different and separate organizations, yet while there were combat and non-combatant organizations, that branches of the SS were driven by the same politics and ideology, and it was certainly possible, if not very common, for individuals to be transferred between concentration camps and the front. German armored formations. There have also been commentators who regard the entire Panzerwaffe German tank army of World War II as an elite force. While this might make sense some of the time, or for certain regiments, it is scarcely supportable across the board. Panzer divisions may have swept all before them from 1939 to late 1941, but by 1942, German armor was often halted by superior numbers, increasingly effective Allied tanks, and other factors. Yet even in 1939, German tanks were not uniformly superior machines, having lighter armament and thinner armor than many of the French machines, for example. The early success of the Panzer depended as much on command, communications, and tactics as it did on machines. Organization was also a big factor in which the Panzer divisions were arranged, as well as all arms, including artillery, motorized infantry, and engineers, tanks being the critical cutting edge rather than the division's only asset. Eliteness was clearly also a matter of personnel as well as the quality of material. When crews were well trained, fuel and ammunition were plentiful, and the men led by visionaries such as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, 1891 to 1944, the General Heinz Gudrun, success was highly likely. If supplies were curtailed, tactics no better than the enemy's, and experienced men dead or sidelined, then the Panzer were as fallible as others. The German here armored formation most commonly regarded as an elite is the Graubünden Division, which was successively a ceremonial guard unit, Watch Regiment, Berlin, formed in 1929, Infantry Regiment, Infantry Division, Panzer Grenadier Division, and ultimately Panzer Corps Grob Deutschland. While initially small in size, the formation was marked out as elite at an early stage, being given the honor of guarding the historic century of Berlin and a distinctive uniform with GD monograms on its shoulders. Through pre-war infantry regiments in general were entitled to the Waffenrock or military dress code. The Grobenschlangen attire, as approved in 1939, included elongated Litzen bars on the collar, bands of French lace on the cuffs, and an armband on the forearm with the Grobenschlangen title in Gothic script. Curiously, Grobenschlangen, a title meaning Greater Germany Schlang, was created in the 1920s specifically because of Germany's internal divisions and fear of trouble in the capital. It actually had little to do for much of its pre-war existence, mounting static guards most days and being marched through the capital twice a week with its regimental band through the Brandenburg Gate to the War Memorial. The whole arrangement had sometimes of a feel of impermanence, given that the British Guard Regiment was actually a representative formation drawn by companies from the 7 divisions of the Republican Army of Weimar Germany. These companies were rotated back to their parent unit every 3 months. After the rise of the Nazis, the Grobenschlangen received a new honor and a new duty in providing a small bodyguard for the Fuhrer when he went abroad. This was dubbed the Führer Beglit Battalion, or escort. The status of permanent infantry regiment came in the summer of 1939, at which the Grobenschlangen began recruiting volunteers from all over the German Reich. While Grobenschlangen did not fight in Poland, it had an important role in the Western Campaign of 1940, part being allotted to Guardian under Kletz's Panzer Group and a battalion being air-landed into Belgium as part of the Operation Nivai. Success followed success as Grobenschlangen then marched in an impressive arc through France via the battlefields of the Somme all the way to the coast between Dunkirk and Calais. Like many other units, the Grobenschlangen was then prepared for the invasion of the UK. With that aborted, it was moved to the east, and in 1941 became part of Army Group Century for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Here, Grobenschlangen was involved in the great battles of encirclement in western Russia, which led to the capture of hundreds of thousands of Russians as well as many enemy counterattacks before the front cemented just outside Moscow and Leningrad. At Tula, Grobenschlangen took significant casualties following a river crossing and fighting in built-up areas. By winter, Grobenschlangen was starving and freezing, but held on with reinforcements and the return of wounded men, and in April 1942 was elevated to divisional status. I'm not right this minute, all right? In the summer of 1942, Grobenschlangen was committed to the Great Drive to the southeast during which it was intended Stalingrad should be seized and the resources of Ukraine and the Caucasus harnessed for the German war effort, while Grobenschlong land attacked with speed and determination. Russian reserves were deployed on the Don, and counterattacks led to severe attrition of both sides as gaps appeared in the front. Trench warfare broke out in the September mud, and in December 1942, Grobenschlong land was attacking again while Stalingrad was progressively encircled. Early in the new year of 1943, Grobenschlong land fought alongside other panzer formations, including the 2 SS Panzer Corps in the 3rd Battalion of Krakow, during which the city was recaptured. In May, with addition of armored personnel carriers, the Grobenschlong land was recategorized as Panzer Grenadier Division Grobenschlong land. Like many other German armored units, Grobenschlong land was committed to the Battle of Kursk and emerged with less than a third of its tanks still operable. Particularly troublesome were the new Panther Panzer V vehicles, which were suffering a variety of teething troubles and breakdowns at this early stage. Grobenschlong land was then withdrawn via Ukraine and into Romania. While the situation of all fronts was worsening, faith in the Grobenschlong land was untarnished. Fighting in the East Persia and the Baltic states in late 1944, Grobenschlong land was now classed as a Panzer Corps in its own right. Oh my God, what the fuck? Okay. It's not that much left. Very little left. Hold on. Even though it had suffered several thousand casualties in recent months and its armored strength was dwindling, in April 1945, part of the division was evacuated across the Baltic and eventually surrendered to British forces, while those remaining in the east were killed or captured by the Russians, other German special forces. We may easily accept that German Fallschirmjäger parachute forces of World War II were elite by dint of their function, special equipment, and successes in the invasions of Belgium in 1940 and Crete in 1941. In the invasion of Belgium, Struckengrumpf, Granite Commander by Oberleutnant Rudolf Witzig, 1916 through 2001, landed atop Fort Ibn Emuel in the much celebrated glider mission, though Witzig himself arrived late due to problems with his tow cable. Despite such imaginative work, the long-term record of the Fallschirmjäger was inconsistent, and many of their later deployments were in ground operations where they suffered, particularly in prolonged defensive battles. There were, however, other German special forces, and initially, at least, these were called into being by intelligence requirements and political imperatives rather than existing military commitments. For these units, the Nazi approach was very different to the Western Allies. The British and Americans certainly used special forces as publicity fodder as well as practical purposes. Commandos and Rangers were only kept quiet so long as strictly necessary. Then their stories were given to the press, played up, and milked for all they were worth. These Allied propaganda efforts were intended to, and often did, provide hope to home audiences and occupied nations, but also brought worry, if not outright terror, to the enemy. The Nazi approach was rather different, and for quite a while the main purpose of German special forces was false flag missions. New German special troops were even needed to start World War II in conformity with a pre-planned Nazi narrative, and the actions of Hitler in 1939 were surprisingly similar to those of Russia in 2014. The Nazis had long promoted the idea that the Treaty of Versailles was hugely unfair and curtailed German freedom, not least by cutting off German minorities in other states. These Volksschlang groups were routinely portrayed as oppressed and prosecuted, whether or not that was the case in reality. Propaganda films and literature suggested downtrodden Germans, particularly in Eastern Europe, were in urgent need of rescue and liberation. As of 1936, the Heim ins Reich campaign targeted states with German minorities, encouraging the idea that parts of these countries should be wrested into German control. Spring 1938 brought a significant part of this plan to fruition when Hitler faced down Czechoslovakia and her British and French supporters at Munich, succeeding in integrating the Sudetenland and about 3 million ethnic Germans into the Reich. The 1938 Nuremberg rally capitalized on this with the theme Reichen, Schlagen, Schlingen, Grow, Schlongland, celebrating the newfound liberation of both the Sudetenland and the Austrians, whom Nazi had always claimed as German. To take this policy to the apparently logical conclusion of attacking Poland would also require the Poles being portrayed as oppressors and warmongers. The men Hitler chose to prove the lie were chief of the Schickenschlicken Dentistry, SD, Reigenhard Heigrendinger, 1904 through 1942, and other intelligence operatives. Among these was Humpfenman Theodor von Hippel, 1890 through 1977, of Section 2 of the Abwehr German Military Intelligence, who was responsible for the organization of special troops. Von Hippel had fought in East Africa during World War I and operated his section under the cover name Bochenland Battalion. Where possible, Section 2 would use volunteers and Volksschlang in tune with the policy of home to the Reich. I'm kind of improvising a little bit of the German, all right? The structure of the Branden Schumburgers were, while German special forces of World War II are often spoken of as the Bragenberger Division, their organization was the movable feast, and operational requirements appear to have dictated both size and form. The first manifestation began even before the war, and in 1939 comprised no more than a modest group aimed against Poland based at Ebenronx. And rightly or wrongly, the Ebenronx team has sometimes been described as a Frikorps, an historic term suggesting an independent force of patriotic volunteers. Frikorps, I thought that would be like liberate the dead people. Anyway, acting outside the officially established military. After the Polish campaign, the net was widened, though the Bragenbergers were still no more than a single battalion based at Bragenberg and Der Havel, from which the name of the force appears to have been drawn. This iteration had 4 companies with specific skills. Oh, thank God. One more page. In different languages and cultures, a company specialized in Russian language and Baltic matters. Another had English, French, and Portuguese expertise. The third were Sudeten Germans and Yugoslavs. And the fourth Those who fitted none of the first three categories, according to Lucas, see the bibliography, and regimental strength of 3 battalions was actually achieved around October 1940, at which time there were 2 operational battalions located at Brandenburg and Baden B. Wien, a town south of Vienna. Wien. Baden B. Wien. South of Vienna. You know, little wieners, little Vienna sausages, the wiener. Bragenby wieners next to Vienna, respectively. The depot was at Düren in western Germany. One of the Russian company was Adrian von Volkersam, 1914 through 1945, who was active on the Eastern Front for much of the war, winning the Knight's Cross while serving on the staff of 1st Battalion Lear Regiment Z.B.V.800 Brandenburg, as it was then known. It was known as that. Once upon a time. As the war progressed, the Brandenburgers grew in size spasmodically. But this was more the result of adding existing resources from the Army, Luftwaffe, or SS, or of operating detachments in different theaters of war. At no point did the Brandenburgers become a full-sized permanent division, which would have entailed a strength of 12,000 to 15,000 men. For the Ardennes operation, the Brandenburg force was described as an armored brigade or battle group which comprised perhaps 2,000 personnel, though the vast majority of these were from existing Luftwaffe, SS, or Army units. For the initial provocation missions against Poland, SD men were ordered to Brennau, where they were clad in Polish uniforms supplied by military intelligence, drilled in the Polish language, and stripped of anything that might be recognized as German, while German police and regular troops stood down during the staged incidents. Some SD men substituted for them, while others played the Polish parts. Though a larger number of raids were planned, just 3 targets were finally selected, being the customs post at Hochlandin, the Gliewitz radio station, and a gamekeeper's cottage at Pitzchen. The staged raids of Operation Hindenburg on 31 August 1939 were given chilling realism by the presence of bodies of concentration camp victims described as canned meat left behind in Polish uniforms provided by the Abwehr. Local Polish farmer Fan Sisik Hanayok was also murdered, specifically to add credibility to the idea that Polish saboteurs were present. SD officer Alfred Neujax led the Gliewitz mission, the most crucial and outrageous of the night. Here, the radio station was left broadcasting while shots were fired at Polish voices shouted. The fact that Gliewitz was a relatively short-range transmitter limited the effectiveness of the plot but it was possible to enhance its impact by means of photographs and reports, which were widely believed in Germany. The next day, American reporters were summoned to Gleiwitz just as Germany invaded Poland. Neujax was captured by the U.S. Army in 1944 and tried at Nuremberg, where he revealed details of the Polish raids. For a number of operations in the period 1940 to 1942, small groups of Brandenburgers were attached to the regular army, acting much as other intelligence and reconnaissance troops might do, probing ahead of the army, locating bridges and crossings, and cutting enemy communications. In 1941, Brandenburgers were deployed to the east, working in Serbia and Romania before taking the point in the invasion of the Soviet Union in June. At the Daugava River, Brandenburgers secured one of its key bridges by repeating the false flag strategy, this time using Soviet uniform. In North Africa, a single company was deployed under Oberleutnant von Konin. In 1941, this Truppenabteilung tropical detachment filled a reconnaissance role using men with previous African experience, or good English. From late 1942, Rudolf Witzig, now a much decorated major of the parachute engineers, was also moved to North Africa with his men. While there were reports of attempts to use both parachutists and gliders in Tunisia, these were apparently ineffectual due to both weather conditions and the change in German fortunes, which would see the surrender of Axis forces in North Africa in May 1943. Soon after the fall of Tunis, German special forces were in action again, this time in a very high-profile mission. With the surrender of fascist Italy, the Italian king had removed and arrested Benito Mussolini in 1883. Mussolini was born and he died in 1945. The annoyed Fuhrer then put in train a plot to have him rescued from custody. So it was that SS Major Otto Skorzeny, born in 1908 and he died in 1975, was suddenly thrust into the limelight. Skorzeny was Austrian by birth and had attended the Technical University of Vienna, where he received not only an engineering education but a distinctive dueling scar. A convinced Nazi, he joined the Austrian SA in 1934 and supported the Anschluss. Early in World War II, he joined the LSSAH, then fought with the SS Das Reich Division in Russia. Following a head wound, he convalesced in Berlin and was given a staff role in which he worked on the development of commando type. Oh, they tricked me with an extra page. Oh, God, please. Oh, there's an extra fucking page. Son of a bitch. I thought I was the only one left. God damn it. I got this one, this page back, this page, and then half of the other one. That's it. Son of a bitch. Tactics. While Skorzeny was involved in the abortive Operation Franciscus in middle 1943, he was sponsored by the SS and SD and thus in competition with the Army and Adwehr, which had given birth to the Brandenburgers. for Operation Oak, otherwise known as the Gran Sasso raid, launched on 12 September 1943. Scorzini was accompanied by 16 SS troops and about 90 Fallschirmjäger, led by Oberleutnant von Berlin in 1918 through 1943 died. These were accommodated in 10 gliders, which were landed as close as possible to the Hotel Campo Imperatore, where Mussolini was being held. Ground attack by the Fallschirmjäger under Major Morse, who was born in 1910 and died in 2001, seized the hotel, and the Italian guards were quickly overcome. Mussolini was then flown out by reconnaissance aircraft accompanied by Scorzini. While the rescue was a celebrated success and an embarrassment to the Allies, the mission had been completed mainly by Luftwaffe parachutists, and only Scorzini's prominent participation allowed the SS to claim credit. After Operation Oak, Scorzini was promoted and awarded the Knight's Cross. Mussolini, perhaps foolishly, allowed himself to be returned to northern Italy to head a German puppet state, the Italian Socialist Republic. Attempting to flee in April 1945, he was executed by hostile partisans. Scorzini would repeat a similar stunt with the capture of the son of the Hungarian regent in 1944, but unlike Mussolini, the young Miklos Horthy Jr., 1907 and 1993, was thrown into Dacia concentration camp, and the Nazis used his capture to manipulate his father. The last significant Scorzini mission before the end of the war was Operation Grief in 1944 during the Adrianese campaign. The purpose of Grief was to secure bridges over the river Meuse before they could be destroyed. For this mission, Scorzini reverted to false flag tactics pioneered by the Brandenburgers in the early part of the war. His command, formerly known as Panzer Brigade 150, was to be disguised as American, and Scorzini hoped to push over 3,000 troops through Allied lines, leading not only to the capture of the bridge, but also a wave of demoralization among the enemy. Panzer Brigade 150 would then hold strategic positions until other units arrived to relieve them. In the event, the number of troops actually involved was lower, and the quantity of tanks in the brigade, more like a squadron. One of two were actually American, but the others were German, with hastily rigid superstructures and paintwork to mimic American vehicles. The greater number of trucks, personnel carriers, and other wheeled vehicles were forthcoming, but even these were fewer than Scorzini's stated requirements, and some required repair even before attempting to the proposed 80-kilometer, 50-mile drive. The largest bodies of men were Luftwaffe parachutists and Panzer grenadiers, with anti-tank companies, maintenance platoons, a mortar company, and others attached. A minority were SS troops from the parachute battalion and Scorzini's personal SS Jagdwer band, Hunter Group. The best English speakers were filtered out of the team, which was to pose as Americans in U.S. Army uniform, dealing with sentries of mixing with the enemy along the way. Where possible, this commando was also to undertake demolitions, interfere with signage and communications, and spread false instructions. Following a poor start on 16 December, Grief eventually reached and attempted to take Malmedy. Though some Germans may have entered the town, this attempt was ultimately unsuccessful. However, Scorzini would later claim American forces had been confused, with some being misdirected away from the battle zone. Certainly, the mission led to consternation and paranoia, with American generals being challenged by their own troops and jumpy military police even firing on soldiers who were slow to confirm their identity. A rumor that the German mission was an assassination attempt on General Eisenhower led his protection team to sequester him away, spending Christmas 1944 in his office. Scorzini suffered his second head wound of the war at Lig Neuville in Belgium and was withdrawn. Many of the Einheitsstelle team survived. Even so, 16 enlisted men were taken prisoner by U.S. troops and executed after a court-martial death sentence. One officer, Lieutenant Gunther Schultz, was arrested traveling in a jeep with other personnel, weapons, and an improvised explosive device, as well as Allied currency, while wearing a mixture of American and German clothing. On questioning, Schultz had admitted to being a member of the Einheitsstelle. Following trial, he was executed on 14 June near Braunschweig. Scorzini himself was judged at the Dachau trials in 1947, where he escaped death when his legal team pointed out that he had not given a direct order to fight in American uniforms, even though these were used. Oh, thank God. As disguises prior to action. Acquitted, Scorzini escaped to Argentina and later served as a bodyguard to Eva Perón. After a spell in Madrid, he relocated to Ireland in 1959, where he ran a farm in County Kildare. Gradually becoming an embarrassment to his Irish hosts, Scorzini moved back to Madrid, where he died of lung cancer in 1975. That's the end of the first chapter. Jesus Christ. God. Fucking Alright. I'll do another one later.